Thank you very much, Zafra, and thank you for organizing this seminar series. And as the questions you got beforehand pointed out, this isn't funded by anyone, and you're doing it as a labor of love. And so I think all of us here are very grateful to you for doing that. And we've learned a lot by being part of it. And I was trying to think of an excuse for why my talk is in a series on Iran, and I realized that maybe it's appropriate to start with I think a quote from Rumi, and I only know it in English, where he says, "My heart knows neither east nor west. No boundaries exist within my breast." And that's really fair, because even though the Western world knows Maulana as Rumi, everybody in Afghanistan calls him Balkhi, the man from Balkh. And that really shows you how Afghanistan has always had very, very deep connections with Iran. And to say that it's been a porous and changing border between those two areas is being very polite about it. But it highlights the more important general principle that Afghanistan has always been a kind of a meeting place of civilizations, and people call it the Crossroads of Asia. And that's really actually an unfair term, because a crossroads implies that everyone just goes through there on their way to somewhere else. And that, in fact, it's probably more appropriate to think of it as a kind of a borderland, which is a term that Rita Wright has often used, and others like Karl Lambert Karlovsky. That borderlands, as we now know, are areas of tremendous cultural creativity and originality. So it's not just a place that everyone passes through on the way to somewhere else. And the corollary of that is that the cultural heritage of Afghanistan is of tremendous importance to the people of Afghanistan, but it's also of tremendous importance for world heritage more generally. That like Maulana Balkhi is an example of someone who's changed the world, and that his it's hard to say if he didn't invent Sufi mysticism, but he changed it forever and made it accessible. His legacy is leaving it accessible to the world. So Afghanistan has made tremendous contributions in the realm of religion. Many people believe that Zoroaster was from this part of Central Asia. And the role of Afghanistan on the Silk Road is tremendous, that it's the pathway by which Buddhism traveled from South Asia, India, its land of origin, all the way to China and the Pacific. So those are just examples of how Afghanistan is a place that really people need to be aware of its heritage. They need to value that heritage, because it is at the same time both the heritage of the people of Afghanistan and world heritage. And I'm really happy to have been able to work in Afghanistan for the last 9 years. And while we were working there, we tried to keep a low profile in our work and didn't talk about it too much, because there's, I think, a law of unintended consequences very often, that you think you're doing something really wonderful, that, oh, I want everyone in the world to know about this, and then somehow these things always come back and bite you. So I think that this is a really good time to just take stock and talk about what we have been able to do, just my own university, and as part of a much broader and very long tradition of working in Afghanistan. And that would, of modern archaeological research, and that, of course, begins with Charles Masson in the early 19th century, but the real modern beginnings are with the French Délégation Archéologique Française en Afghanistan. DAFA has made tremendous contributions to the preservation of that heritage. the discovery and the preservation of that heritage, I should say. So I want to talk today about just the University of Chicago's little small piece of work in heritage preservation. And if you'll pardon my being repetitive, most of you, I'm sure, are aware of this, but just to be on the same page, cultural heritage in the UNESCO definition is the legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a group that are inherited from past generations, maintained in the present, and preserved for future generations. And that's kind of a very heuristic, almost mechanistic definition, and it's completely right. But cultural heritage really is so much more than that, that we need to be aware of what makes it so important. And the animating idea behind that definition is the ideological dimension, that heritage is something that binds together communities and nations through a shared history and shared identity. And it's not a cliche to say that it defines who we are, and it's also a non-renewable resource. And therefore it is something that when it's gone, if it is destroyed, it's gone forever. And that means that the stakes in preserving it are enormously high. And Afghanistan has a tremendously rich cultural heritage, but 42 years of continuous war have devastated the country and its cultural heritage. And it goes all the way back to the Soviet invasion and withdrawal from 1979 to 1989. And then immediately after the Soviet withdrawal, and here you see them going back over the International Friendship Bridge at Termez. And of course, the International Friendship Bridge is how the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in the first place. And after they left, the civil war began between the different Mujahideen groups who had successfully defeated the Soviets. And it ended with a Taliban victory in 1995 and their takeover of Kabul. And then the US invasion and counterinsurgency from 2001 to 2021. And then, of course, the most recent and enormously, I'll call it earth-shaking development of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in August of 2021. So 42 years of continuous war, generations have grown up knowing nothing but that. And that has been devastating to the Afghan people, to the Afghan economy, the Afghan agriculture. At every level, it's been devastating. And as part of that broader set of just hammer blows, there's been tremendous damage to Afghan cultural heritage. And national museums are really the focal point for many countries as the place that is the main steward of that cultural heritage, the place where all the material record that documents this history of civilizations is concentrated in national museums. And so as part of this unending conflict, the National Museum of Afghanistan was terribly damaged, and from between 1989 and 2001, from a variety of things. That during the 1989 to 95 Civil War, the museum was on the front lines in Kabul between the territories of two different Mujahideen groups. And so it was shelled, it was looted, and it was burned in that civil war. And then after Taliban control in between January and March 2001, there was a second wave of destruction within the museum by the Taliban. I'll get to that in a little bit. But you have to recognize the devastation that happened in the Civil War. And I hope these pictures give a bit of a picture of it, that the museum was just demolished. Most of it was a burnt out shell. And we don't really know, but we have good estimates Omar Khan Masudi, the just beloved, now retired director of the National Museum, estimated that about 70% of the museum's pre-war collections were either looted or destroyed. And the estimate is that's about 140,000 objects that were lost or destroyed. And that is, to put that number in context, think about the Baghdad Museum, that it was a world scandal when the National Museum in Baghdad in Iraq was looted, and the number of objects that were taken from Baghdad, 15,000. So compare that with 140,000 lost from the National Museum of Afghanistan. And that will give you an idea of the scale of this disaster. And most people in the world hadn't really even heard about what befell the National Museum. And to make it even worse, if you look at that the center picture on this slide, an estimated 90% of the museum's registration records were burned during the Civil War. So that's probably even more than the objects being destroyed. The records of them being destroyed is the nightmare of any museum, and it happened to the museum in Kabul. So the pre-war collections of the museum were estimated at about 200,000 objects, but the museum had never had a full inventory. The museum was first developed created in 1921 under Amanullah Khan, but it had never had a complete inventory. And so what I wanted to start by doing is to just give you a very brief overview of why this museum is so remarkable and important, and just giving you a quick preview of 5 collections of the National Museum that I think are enormously significant and pretty much unique. I'll say either almost unique or totally unique. So the first of those 5 is the site of Bagram, or ancient Kapisa. And Kapisa was the summer capital of the Kusan Empire in the 1st, 2nd centuries CE. And it was excavated by Dafa in the late 20s and 30s. And I would say indisputably, it's the single most important site, archaeological site, for documenting the archaeology, the history, the trade, and the cross-cultural contacts of the Silk Road. The excavators found sealed rooms, perfect, like an archaeologist's dream of the sealed stratigraphic context, and they were filled with these luxury trade goods from everywhere, whether Chinese lacquer work from Han Dynasty China, Hellenistic art. You have the largest depiction of the lighthouse in Alexandria on this cut rock crystal vase, Roman bronze weights, beautiful, amazing carved ivories that show very, very clear South Asian Indian influence, and even representations of sort of the Homa bird that's so important in Iranian culture. All of this together in 2 sealed rooms. So you can't find better documentation of the origins of the Silk Road, which began in the time of Han Dynasty China, Parthian Iran, and linked China with the Mediterranean and the Roman Empire. So that's the first of the collections. The second one is the site of Ai Khanum, which is one of the easternmost of the colonies. It wasn't founded by Alexander himself, but rather by his Seleucid successors in the 3rd century BCE. And it's remarkable because it's like a Greek polis founded on the banks of the Oxus River. And it's an astounding discovery made by the king of Afghanistan, Zahir Shah, on a hunting expedition where he was sort of taking a rest and leaned back against something. He realized there was this like giant stone capital of with acanthus leaves and everything. And he realized what he'd found, and he contacted Dafa, and the excavations were done there by Paul Bernard. Ai-Khanum is incredibly important as a source about the Hellenistic period and the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms. It's one of our best sources of knowledge about the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms. And it is a fusion of East and West, even though everyone pays attention to the Greek, Macedonian, Hellenistic aspect of it. It's very much grounded in Central Asia. The temples there are of Central Asian form. They're carved figurines of Anahita. It is very much a fusion of East and West. The third of the unique, and this one is really unique collections, is from Tilla Tepe, the Mound of Gold, and it's better known as the Bactrian Treasure, and it's a hoard of gold masterpieces from the 1st century CE tombs of invading Central Asian nomadic tribes, who the Chinese sources refer to as the Yuezhi. These were the people who, when they settled down and essentially took over the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, they developed into what we now know as the Kusan Empire. The tombs were excavated by the very famous Soviet archaeologist Viktor Saryanidi, and he excavated 6 tombs of these nomadic elites, chiefs, and their spouses, and the gold and other finds from there are remarkable, and they show again a fusion of Central Asian shamanism. If you look at the picture on the right, the master of dragons, gold jewelry, and then the animal style art of the Scythians, and then Hellenistic art. So on the left, you see Dionysus and Ariadne. You also see figures of Aphrodite with the bindi dot on her forehead. So it's a fusion with South Asia, with shamanistic art of Central Asia, with Scythian art, and with Hellenistic art. It's unbelievable. And this exhibit, the National Geographic Society helped bring it to the United States, but it's a traveling exhibit that went all around the world. It's there in Afghanistan. There's nothing like it anywhere else. Then the last of the 5 just examples of irreplaceable, tremendously important collections at the National Museum is the Nuristani or Kafiristani wood carvings. And these are they're sculptures that depict humans and deities of this ancient Indo-European or Indo-Iranian, I should say, Indo-Iranian polytheistic religion that was practiced in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan until its conversion to Islam at the end of the 19th century by the Amir Abdul Rahman, the Iron Amir. And so these, because of its being pagan by the monotheistic definition, it was called Kafiristan, the land of the unbelievers, up until its conversion to Islam in around, I think it was roughly 1895 under Abdul Rahman, and then it became known as Nuristan, the land of light. So these are the 5 collections that, for me, they really highlight the importance of the museum, and they make the devastation of the museum all the more a tragedy. And so in the wake of 2001 and the US-led invasion, efforts began to rebuild the physical museum, and it was beautifully restored. Once the physical structure had been restored, the US State Department invited grant proposals to try and rebuild I guess you could call it the information infrastructure of the museum. So over the last 9 years, the University of Chicago has had 4 grants from the US State Department with the National Museum of Afghanistan and with the Archaeological Institute, the Afghanistan Archaeological Institute. So the first is our partnership with the OI, between the OI, the Oriental Institute, and the NMA, the National Museum of Afghanistan. And our job was to develop a digital database and conduct the first ever complete inventory of the NMA. And as part of that, an integral part of that, our job was training and capacity building for museum conservators, curators, and database managers. The second was a core operations grant that supported us to do our Hadas sculptural restoration project and provide advanced training for museum conservators. Our third project is the Afghan Heritage Mapping Project, which was a collaboration with the Archaeology Institute of Afghanistan. And there we've been using remote sensing satellite mapping to locate as many of the archaeological sites of Afghanistan as possible, and to also conduct GIS training for the Afghanistan Institute of Archaeology. So basically what we were doing is what you would call preservation through documentation of, unless you know where the sites are, you can't protect them. And I'll be talking about that also in just a bit. And then the fourth project is very different. It was a dream of Nancy Hatch Dupree, who is sort of the mother of Afghanistan's cultural heritage preservation. And Nancy's dream was always to have bring the museum to the people of Afghanistan outside of Kabul. So those are the four projects that and their activities that I want to run through and just give you at least a brief overview of this work. So in our partnership with the OI, between the OI and the National Museum of Afghanistan, we were really committed to a couple of principles. And the first was on-site in-country training. And our team lived and worked in Kabul from 2012 to 2019 until the COVID-19 pandemic. The second core principle was that we were going to develop a bilingual database in Dari and in English, and that we would do this in full consultation with our colleagues at the NMA. And so the way we did it, that is that the categories and variables and its format, they all were designed to reflect the surviving existing NMA registration practices and simply morph them into an electronic form. And then the third aspect I think is really important as well. The third principle that we followed was appropriate technology, that the State Department wanted us to do, like a state-of-the-art internet-based database, like on Oracle or SAP or something. And we told them, no, we're not going to do that. That we're going to, we want to have something that is sustainable and where it's easy to train people. So we chose a laptop-based system, which was not dependent on the internet or even reliable electricity. And we wanted to use inexpensive, widely available, off-the-shelf, which is an English expression meaning you can just buy it in a store rather than having to subscribe to a really emaborate database where you never even own it, you only sort of rent it. So we picked FileMaker Pro just because it is so widely available, it's so easy to learn, and it's so well documented. There's a whole bookshelves full of guides to how to use FileMaker Pro. So that's what we proposed to the State Department, that's how we would do our inventory. And I called it the Chevrolet pickup truck of databases, that you can bang it around, you can really knock it around, and it will still survive. So this is an example that we essentially spent a month or so doing ethnography in the National Museum, meeting with all the different departments and especially the museology department to understand how they did their paper records. And that we essentially took those and incorporated them as the main part of our data entry. And again, the whole idea was to make it something that our Afghan colleagues at the NMA would feel comfortable with, that it gave them the information that they wanted. And we added to it, of course, we added other variables that we felt were useful and important as well. But the very heart of it and the majority of it are categories that already existed for the museum. And again, that was with an eye towards it being sustainable, because we always knew our grants were going to end sooner or later. So that's how we formatted it. And then it was fully bilingual in both Dari and English. And here in the upper left, you see there's a picture of Mike Fisher, who was our first field director in Kabul, and he's the man who really designed this this database. And we used actually excavation databases that I've been using in Syria and then also in Iraq. And what you can see is parallel data entry between the Afghan curators of the museum and our Oriental Institute team. And here you can see a little bit of the bilingual character recording some textiles in the museum in Dari and English. And as part of our inventorying, we did sort of emergency conservation and really a kind of a triage to try and identify which artifacts were in greatest need of conservation. We also shipped over 2 giant shipping containers filled with steel shelving for the museum, and we rehoused all of the artifacts on steel shelving and in archival quality acid-free containers, acid-free housing, so that the collection was better off. And in the end, we were able to inventory more than 144,000 pieces in more than 46,000 inventory records. We also did in-country training for conservators, and this is Fabio Colombo, our project conservator, working with members of the conservation staff at the museum. And Fabio conducted a whole series of workshops on different topics, including things like photography and most notably unbaked clay sculpture. All the early Buddhist sculptures, or a vast majority of them, are either stucco or unbaked clay. And this is a publication we did, an in-house publication of our clay sculpture workshop, and it's trilingual in Dari, in Pashto, and in English. We also held organized a conference, an international conference on preserving the cultural heritage of Afghanistan. We did it at Kabul University. It was bilingual with simultaneous translation in English and Dari. We organized it so half of the participants were Afghan scholars, because we really wanted to highlight the role of Afghan heritage specialists in preserving their own heritage. And we published it as a bilingual publication in English and Dari, and that publication is available for free from the Oriental Institute website as a downloadable free PDF. As part of our work at the museum, we also did the what we call the Hada Sculptural Project, which is restoration of objects in the National Museum that have been smashed by the Taliban. Hada is one of the most important early Buddhist sites. It dates to the time of the Kusan Empire and extends beyond it. It's right near the Khyber Pass in southeast Afghanistan. It's been essentially absorbed by the modern day city of Jalalabad. And Hada also was excavated by Dafa very early on by Bartow. And this monastery complex yielded amazing amounts of early Buddhist sculpture, and it's some of the earliest art to depict the Buddha. That for the first 3 or 4 centuries of Buddhism, Buddhism was aniconic, and the Buddha was only represented by like his parasol or his footprint or the banyan tree under which he meditated under which he became enlightened. So it's extraordinarily important in the cultural history and in the religious history of Afghanistan and the world. And so the objects from Hada, half of them are in the Musée Guimet in Paris, and the other half are in the National Museum. In the lead up to the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban in 2001, they went through the National Museum of Afghanistan with sledgehammers, and every sculpture that they were able to find, they smashed into bits. There was nothing that the museum staff could do about it. They waited until the Taliban left the museum, then they swept up all the pieces and secretly hid them in trunks in the basement. And then it was several years after we were there before they finally told us about these trunks in the basement. And so there are more than 7,600 fragments of Buddhist sculptures from Hada that you can see on these pictures, the fresh sledgehammer marks from the Taliban destruction in 2001. And so what we decided we wanted to do is to try and reassemble as many of these sculptures as possible. Here you can see the trunks, the actual trunks that the fragments that were swept up by the museum curators, how they were saved and hidden in the museum. And this picture I thought was pretty amazing of what happened. And so we worked with the conservation staff of the National Museum to clean and stabilize the fragments. And then we worked to reassemble them as many as we could. We found and put aside all the pieces that had registration numbers. And we tried to match them. The fragments we were reassembling with, there were a few catalogs from before the war of selected objects from the museum. And one of the most important ones was by Francine Tissot, and it cataloged about 1,400 objects from the museum. So what we were able to do is as we reassembled them, we tried to match them up with objects in Tissot's catalog. And so we were able to determine on that basis, first of all, we were able to reassemble, I should say partially reassemble, very partially. Here you can see the original accession photo of a sculptural fragment from Hada. You can see how it was smashed up by the Taliban, and then our team, Fabio Colombo and Elisa Panunzio and Alejandro Gallego Lopez, were able to partially reassemble them. So on that basis, we're able to determine these sculptures were not stolen from the museum. They were there, but in a horribly damaged condition. The next project that we did was with the Afghanistan Institute of Archaeology, a partnership to use remote sensing to document all of the archaeological sites that were findable in Afghanistan, and to also monitor the looting of heritage sites. And also, as part of this idea of preservation through documentation, we're not just doing research on these sites, but we also wanted to document them so that if there's economic development, that the presence of heritage sites could be documented, and hopefully any damage could be mitigated either by rerouting economic development projects or by doing rescue archaeology at those projects. And as part of that, there was a major focus on training the staff of the Afghanistan Institute of Archaeology in the use of geographic information systems, GIS, for heritage preservation. So the kind of sites that were detected in our remote sensing images are, the vast majority of them are ancient settlement mounds. And here you can see looters' pits all over one of those settlement mounds. Caravanserais, which have a very, very standardized construction that crosses the boundaries of the different gunpowder empires, like the Safavids and the Mughals and the Ottomans, even further west. So caravanserais, Kanats or Karis, and our colleague Mernouche Sarouche has done very important work on identification of Qanat and Karis in Iran, and we're doing something similar in Afghanistan. Architectural remains, cities, and even kurgans, burial mounds as well. So we've been doing, up till very recently, we've been doing all of this through visual inspection of the remote sensing images. And we were able to cover more than 37% of the territorial extent of Afghanistan with just eyeballing and very close analysis of the remote sensing images. And as part of that, combining the analysis of the remote sensing images with the archaeological gazetteer of Afghanistan and its second draft of that work, Ball spearheaded, and with the records of the Afghanistan Institute of Archaeology. So combining all those resources, we were able to locate more than 29,000 archaeologically significant locales, which would include irrigation, things like qanats, but also settlement mounds and caravanserais, et cetera. And that's just in 37% of the country. We mapped past and ongoing site looting. We conducted 6 GIS training courses for the AIA. We built a GIS lab in the AIA building. And then in the last year, we started working on developing an artificial intelligence, an AI deep learning model for computer automated site detection through the remote sensing imagery. We've also really focused on trying to develop new methods that would be of use in the analysis of remote sensing imagery. And Tony Lauricella from the OI's Center for Ancient Middle Eastern Landscapes, in collaboration with Emily Hammer and other people, developed a way to identify the visual signature of looters' pits in remote sensing imagery, and they published an article on that in 2017. So here you can see that site of Ai Khanum, that a Hellenistic Greco-Bactrian city, and which was terribly looted, the city along the Oxus River. And this is the analysis of the computer identification of the looters' pits through principal components analysis. We also have worked with the AIA in trying to incorporate cultural heritage into the economic development planning process. And one of the most important aspects of that is this thing called TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India planned natural gas pipeline. And here you can see the, I don't know, is that fuchsia colored line crossing Afghanistan of the planned route of the pipeline. And so we worked with the AIA to scan a 10-kilometer wide buffer zone, 5 kilometers on each side of the entire pathway of the pipeline across Afghanistan. And we were able to locate, again, combining sites from the Gazetteer of Afghanistan with the AIA's existing site records, and then the remote sensing imagery, especially LiDAR and Buckeye imagery. And we were able to document in that buffer zone 1,733 significant sites. And then we classified the sites by prioritized categories. The priorities, the way we prioritize them was by what we took to be their archaeological significance. So large multi-period sites would have the highest information content, and then sites that were closest to the actual footprint of the pipeline. And we classified them as low, medium, and high risk. And this is an example of a very important famous site that was excavated by Louis Dupree, the husband of Nancy Hatch Dupree, And he's really the first American to do really major archaeological work in Afghanistan. And so Demirase Gundai is one of the sites that Dupre found. So that is that we have that we've collected that information and put it together. And the ideal would be to share that information with development entities like the World Bank, so that whatever work gets done can be done taking these sites at risk, taking their presence and location into account, and ideally mitigating it whenever possible. We also worked with the AIA to develop a red list of endangered sites, and there have been red lists of Afghanistan before that were developed for the US and allies counterinsurgency efforts with the Afghan government. This one was specifically originally designed to try and identify sites that would be endangered by warfare, but really it goes beyond that to identify other sites at risk as well. We also had a major program of training our Afghan colleagues it says AIS, but it's really AIA, that's a typo. We did courses, we did an alliance with Kabul Polytechnic University, which has an astounding 90 workstation GIS lab. And then because they're a polytechnic university, they put a solar array on the roof so they would have an uninterruptible power source for their GIS stations. And then they sold the excess of electricity to the municipality of Kabul. So it was a win-win for everyone. So we started off doing courses in collaboration with Kabul Polytechnic. And then we brought 6 of our colleagues from the AIA to Chicago for a capstone training course in GIS. And then we continued, we made the switch from GIS, which is proprietary to the Esri Corporation. We switched to QGIS, which is an open source form of GIS, so it's sustainable, and the AIA would not have to pay an annual fee to license it. So we did 6 courses training the AIA, and the staff of the AIA are now very, very good at the analysis of remote sensing imagery, both for the documentation and research on sites, but also for cultural heritage preservation. And we had a number of different instructors teaching those courses. I mentioned the the deep learning model, the AI model for computer generated recognition of archaeological sites. And so this shows you how one of the ways we were developing this in collaboration with the Research Computing Center at Chicago. We had already documented thousands of mounded sites. So we used those as a teaching set to teach the computer, this is what real sites look like. And these are tiles in the remote sensing imagery that are not sites. So just through a series of iterations, we've trained the model in how to identify sites. And we are now grinding through just all the imagery of Afghanistan, first the LiDAR imagery, and then Buckeye, and then other sources as well. Then the last project that I wanted to talk about is the Mobile Museum Project, which is a partnership between the National Museum of Afghanistan and the University of Chicago. And the idea was it's very hard for people in the provinces to get access to the National Museum. And so our 2 goals were, we wanted to raise people's awareness of cultural heritage, and we also wanted to get people to understand the importance of the National Museum of Afghanistan as the steward of that heritage. And so we focused on programs to teach programs in high schools in Kabul and 5 provincial capitals. And it's a multimedia thing, and the first part of the multimedia program in these high schools across Afghanistan was an intro video where the director of the National Museum, Fahim Rahimi, explains the significance of the museum and its collections. And we really emphasize that these monuments and objects are the public, they're state property, and they belong to the people of the country. We wanted to encourage people to see the museum as their museum. Then we trained instructors, male and female instructors who are bilingual in Dari and Pashto, to teach the program in high schools across Afghanistan. And we wanted to be as gender equal as possible in these programs. And we wanted to reach as many people as we could. So we taught the program in girls' high schools, in boys' high schools, in orphanages, which is a totally underserved group of people, and in Lincoln Learning Centers, which were sort of little libraries and cultural centers inside the local Ministry of Culture offices in cities around Afghanistan. And we wanted to be try and experiment with new ways of teaching. And so we used this concept called object-based learning, where you encourage students to handle the artifacts as thinking tools to promote learning and engagement. And I think we all know there's a huge difference between seeing a PowerPoint picture of an artifact and actually being able to pick that thing up, turn it around in your hands, haft it, see what it's like, and you really get a better idea of the object, but it also makes the past real to people. So we took 21 objects from the National Museum's collections, and we 3D scanned them. That's what you're seeing there. And then we used a 3D printer and printed up exact replicas of the objects. And then we painted the objects so that they would actually look like the originals. And then at the end of each of our in-class programs in these high schools across Afghanistan, we brought out these objects which the instructors used in teaching, and then we invited all the students to come up in small groups one at a time to physically examine the objects, and they really liked that. They really engaged the students very effectively. So we were able to do programs in not just in Kabul, but in 5 other regional capitals, the 5 largest cities in Afghanistan, in Bamiyan, in Mazar-e Sharif, in Herat, in Kandahar, and in Jalalabad. And so in the end, we were able to visit 6 cities. We physically showed up and taught the program in more than 280 schools, and we reached something like 23,000 students in these high schools. And then we decided that it would be really important to extend the reach of this program beyond just in-person programs. And so we started a collaboration with the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University, which had been founded by Nancy Dupre. And one of the really neat features of this ACKU, Afghanistan Center, is what they call the Able Literacy Program, where Nancy Dupre developed this idea of having like little libraries all over Afghanistan to help teach literacy to people, both children and adults. And so there are 277 of these Able libraries in 34 provinces all across the country. And astoundingly, they reach more than 1 million readers across Afghanistan. So our project wrote 2 books to increase awareness of heritage and the role of the NMA in presenting it. And one was for children and one was for a broad audience of young readers and adults. And we printed up 4,000 copies in mid-July of 2021 in both Dari and Pashto, 1,000 copies of each book in Dari, so 2,000 of them, and 2,000 in Pashto. So this is the first one, the children's book, which they got great artists, and it's called A Gift from Our Ancestors, and it's built around the Cup of Blessings, the Do Barakat vessel from Ghazni. And Ghazni, of course, was the capital of the Ghaznavid Empire of Mahmud al-Ghazni. And I have to mention that Ferdowsi wrote the Shahnameh in the court of Mahmud al-Ghazni, and Mahmud al-Ghazni never really paid him properly for it. And so Ferdowsi got gypped, he got taken, unfortunately. But anyway, so this cup of two blessings, it's really a dish. And in this, it's a story. It's an imaginative fiction where a young boy and girl, and we wanted to make it gender equal. So we had a boy and girl discover this vessel, and they bring it to the museum where a curator translates the inscription for them and explains the history. And then the children sort of dream and speculate with each other about the story of the vessel and what life was like in medieval times. So we're talking about the 10th to 12th century, I guess. Then the second book is called The National Museum of Afghanistan and Our Cultural Heritage, and it's meant for high school age and adult readers to give them an overview of the main civilizational periods in Afghan history while introducing them to the importance of the NMA as the place where they can see and learn about the actual ancient objects that embody that history. And so it gives a very short summary of each period and has illustrations of the iconic objects from each of those periods. So those are the 4 projects that we did in Afghanistan. And the first real blow to them was the COVID epidemic, when at the 2019 was the last time our team was able to be there in Afghanistan. And so we haven't been there since then, and we had to shift to entirely online interaction with our Afghan colleagues and our project crews in Afghanistan. And then, of course, in August of 2021, the Taliban took over the entire country, and including Kabul, and founded a new government, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So, of course, everyone in the heritage community, and it's been in world media as well, is very, very concerned about Afghan heritage and what's going to happen to it under this new regime. And that concern is very well founded because of the history of the Taliban the last time they were in power. So it's a very real concern, and also in the unsettled conditions, looting of sites flourishes as well. And so it's really important to be clear-eyed in trying to assess what that present and future is. And it's very, very hard to figure out, but there are some interesting and I think maybe glimmers of hope that it's not a totally bleak picture. So this is one of the first things I wanted to show people, because I don't think it's widely known, but this is a statement by the Islamic Emirate, that's the state entity of the Taliban, regarding the protection and preservation of ancient heritage. And I want you to look at the date, which is February 20th, 2021, 6 months before the Taliban took over. And this is a public statement that they issued saying that they instruct all members of their government and just people to preserve their heritage. And they recognize that Afghanistan is a country replete with ancient artifacts and antiquity, and no one's allowed to do illegal excavations. No one's allowed to transport or sell historic artifacts anywhere or move it outside of the country. So this is a really remarkable statement that they made on February 20th. So they are saying all the right things in this statement. And the real question is, to what extent will they enforce, will they live up to this statement? But it's a really good beginning. At least it's there, and they said it. They also did something very important, the Taliban, that unlike Baghdad, the minute the Taliban took over Kabul, they sent guards to the National Museum of Afghanistan. And there you see a group of these guards standing at the gate of the museum. And we all know that looting flourishes in a time of a breakdown of security. And that did not happen. It's really important to emphasize that they protected the museum and did not loot it, and they didn't allow other people to loot it. And then just recently, really, 3 days ago, or 3 or 4 days ago, the National Museum of Afghanistan reopened. Now, of course, no one's getting paid, but the museum reopened. They left the director in place, and the staff are there. So ground zero, if you want to think of it that way, for the cultural heritage of Afghanistan is under the protection of the government and has reopened. So it's not a completely bleak picture, but we really have to see how things play out in terms of the actual behavior of the Taliban and other people. Are they going to enforce the laws? That's a complete unknown. And I should mention that this is a concern across all the other forms of heritage as well, including intangible heritage like music, that they haven't made any statement saying that music is protected. And there have been a lot of reports around Afghanistan of people going after musicians and classical Afghan musical instruments and smashing them up. So that is not being observed in practice, the protection of music as intangible heritage. But at least for the moment, officially they're protecting heritage. But we all know that there are isolated sites all across Afghanistan that are really beyond the reach of people to monitor. And then this showed up, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, the AKTC. Aga Khan Trust for Culture, AKTC, started an Instagram sort of notification system. And in September, they reported that the AKTC reported that an Iranian blog, Sedaye Miras, published an article claiming that 12 kilograms of gold artifacts excavated illegally at Tilya Tepe had entered into the Iranian black market in the last 2 months, and they circulated pictures of them. So I saw this, and I contacted my colleague Ramin Yashmi, and I asked him, Ramin, can you please track down this report? And Ramin did a great job. That he located the original article, which and sent me a screenshot of it, and he also very kindly translated it. So the article shows pictures, Instagram pictures of gold objects that are purported to come from Tilya Tepe. And the thing is, without direct examination, it's very hard to know for certain if these objects are real or fake. And even if they're real, do they actually derive from Tilya Tepe? But it's quite possible that they do. So the thing is then that we don't really know if looting is continuing in Afghanistan, but given the size of the country and the economic catastrophe that the country is suffering, it's very likely that looting is continuing and may even grow. And that's something that we have to monitor over time. But so the question is, are these objects that Sedaye Miras talks about, are they real, and are they from Tilya Tepe? So just to show you, this is where Tilya Tepe is. It's right next to the border of Turkmenistan, very close to it, and Iran's here, Uzbekistan here. It was a mid-second millennium fortress with a very, very Iranian-looking pottery coming out of it. And then these blue rectangles and brown rectangles represent the tombs, the nomadic tombs of the Uwejje princes and their partners that Saryanidi excavated, and that was in 1979. So these are the objects that show up. The pictures show up in the Instagram pictures that Sedaye Miras used. And I want you to look at like this. Can you see these turquoise, little pieces of turquoise inlay there? And then these discs with both carnelian and turquoise. And then these are what the original, at least a small, tiny sample of the actually scientifically excavated finds from the Tilya Tepe tombs. And you can see those shapes and of the turquoise inlays are the same. These gold discs are the same. And then the use of turquoise and carnelian is also the same. So the thing is, all these pictures are published in catalogs. So anyone who wanted to fake the stuff, they'd know pretty much exactly what kind of things they wanted to copy. So it's very, very hard to know, are they real or not? So that's basically what our team from the University of Chicago did in cultural heritage preservation in Afghanistan, and at least an initial impression of what's going on in the heritage situation in Afghanistan now. But I'm the first to admit to you, I don't have direct knowledge of this stuff, and I'm just trying to monitor and find out whatever I can about it. And I think all of us have a responsibility to help our Afghan colleagues who have been trying to get out of Afghanistan, to help them. And you know, it's a really wonderful thing that the UK and France and Germany have all taken in refugee scholars from Afghanistan. And that's an example to the rest of the world that we really have to do whatever we can to help our colleagues and Afghan refugees in general. It's a moral obligation for all of us. So, and then I'll just end with this great carving outside of the National Museum of Afghanistan. A nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. So thank you very much for listening. And I know that was way longer than it should have been, and I apologize for that.